Just waiting till a few more takes their seats, and then we'll get started. Great.
The mic is
Oh, it is. This one is. Yeah. Oh, I have to speak up. All right. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. I think, Juan, will have to be, you'll have a permanent crook in your back otherwise. Oh, you have a mic. Good. Okay, well, that's good. I'd like to welcome all of you this afternoon to the Great Issues Lecture. This is a series that the Dickey Center began about 2.5 years ago. And Juan, I think you're about speaker number 8. And this is a very distinguished lectureship that we have begun to focus on great issues of the day. And this set of issues and this set of lectures pays tribute to Dartmouth President John Sloan Dickey and to his belief, which was reflected in the Great Issues course taught at Dartmouth till I guess it was about the early 1970s, during his presidency, that an important part of the Dartmouth education should be acquiring competence in civic engagement and responsibility. He was particularly concerned that these competencies should include understanding of complex global issues. And of course, that is very much the subject of today's presentation by Professor Juan. The subject of democracy building, the subject of Iraq is very, very much on all of our minds today, as is cartoons. And to make the formal introduction of Professor Cole, I'd now like to call on Professor Jean Garthwaite of the History Department. Professor Garthwaite.
Thank you very much, Ken. And on behalf of the Dartmouth community, I would like to thank you for your foresight in reconvening great issues. I think the great issues ended in 1966. Marisa and I have been here since 1968, and they ended just before we came. But I think it's a splendid idea, and thanks to you for sponsoring this, and especially today for inviting our speaker. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Professor Juan, an internationally recognized authority on the Middle East, particularly Shi'i Islam, and more recently on Iraq. And there are few people that are better informed to deal with this very knotty issue than Professor Cole. As an aside, and quite by coincidence, today is not only the 9th of February, but it's the 10th of Muharram, Ashura, the most important day for the Shia that marks the martyrdom and death of the Imam Hussein at Karbala in the 7th century. And if you've listened to the news this morning, you know that there have been some Sunni Shi'i clashes in Pakistan and in Iraq and other places in the Middle East as well. Professor Cole's route to his academic specialty and current appointment has been typically circuitous and tied up very much to contemporary Middle Eastern history. He studied history and religion at Northwestern University as an undergraduate and went to Beirut to pursue an MA at American University Beirut, but only to be evacuated to Jordan when the Lebanese Civil War broke out. He did complete his MA, but at the University of Cairo, and stayed on as an Arabic translator, I think in Syria. He returned to the United States to pursue his PhD at UCLA, but his plans to research his thesis in Iran were thwarted by the Iranian Revolution, and so he ended up instead in Pakistan and India. After he finished his doctorate, his life has been more regular, and he has moved up through the ranks at the University of Michigan, where he is professor of modern Middle East and South Asian history and he now serves as co-chair of the history department there. He's published widely and extensively, some 5 books. Most recently, this one, Sacred Space and Holy War, The Politics, Culture, and History of Shiite Islam. In addition to his books, he's published many articles, given many papers, and lectures. He has also become a major public intellectual on the Middle East and has given numerous media and press appearances and interviews. There are a few better informed on the contemporary Middle East, especially Iraq, than Juan Coles. So it's my great pleasure to welcome him this afternoon to Dartmouth and join me in inviting him to the podium.
Thanks. Well, let me test this mic. Is it working, everybody? You're sure? I once taught a class for a semester. At the end of the semester, there were a couple students who sat in the back. They came up and said, "Professor, we couldn't hear you very well." I said, "Well, you could have said something before now." So let me know if you can't hear me. Today I want to talk about Iraq and the context of the recent elections on December 15th and the new government that is now being formed at a deliberate pace in Iraq. And just to situate what we're talking about here, I'm going to especially look at the Shiite political parties, which have dominated the last parliament, represent a majority of the country, will dominate the coming parliament. And just to situate Iraqi Shiism in a larger field of the religion, the Shiite branch of Islam is a minority branch. It's about 10% of the Muslims in the world. If there are 1.2 billion Muslims, then there are 120 million Shiites. But while there aren't very many in Morocco or in Indonesia and so forth, there are a lot of Shiites in the region of the Persian Gulf. Iraq is majority Shiite. Iran, which has a population of 70 million or so, is 90% Shiite, we think. Lebanon has a Shiite plurality, probably 45%, and growing. The demographics of Lebanon make it very likely in the next 10 to 20 years it will be a Shiite majority country. Bahrain, where the U.S. has a naval base, is 2/3 Shiite, but it has a Sunni king. Shiites predominate in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. That's important to all of those of you in the audience who drive, because the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is where 9 million barrels a day of petroleum are produced out of the 83 million that are produced in the world. And so the Shiites have a position there in Saudi Arabia that's marginal, and they have been much persecuted, but they could be very important because they're about 1/3 of the workers on the oil rigs and so forth. Pakistan, it's hard to know, probably around 13% Shiite. About 5% of Indian Muslims are Shiite. 15 to 18% of Afghans are Shiite. And the Afghan Shiites formed part of the Northern Alliance. So they came into American politics when the Americans put the Northern Alliance in power in Kabul to replace the Taliban. The Taliban having been very, very committed Sunnis and having massacred the Shiites on occasion. Iraq, in all of this field, is not the largest Shiite community, but it is a very central community because, first of all, much of early Shiite sacred history occurred on Iraqi soil. And so there are 2 major shrine cities, the Najaf, south of Baghdad, where the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, Ali, was cut down, assassinated in 661. His tomb is in Najaf. People go from the Shiite world there on pilgrimage. And then Karbala, where, as we heard, the grandson of the Prophet, Imam Hussein, died in 680, having led a rebellion against the then Islamic Empire. Karbala, again, south of Baghdad, and there are today in Karbala 1 million pilgrims from all over mainly the Shiite world, and the place has been locked down. There's lots of security because there have been bombings and so forth. So Najaf and Karbala are shrine cities, are pilgrimage sites, and Najaf also is a seminary city where people go to learn to become clerics in the tradition. And the Grand Ayatollah of Najaf, the chief Grand Ayatollah of Najaf, tends to be the most respected Shiite clerical authority outside of Iran itself. So if you ask people in Lebanon, many of the people in places like Bahrain, Afghanistan, Pakistan, who do you follow for your religious guidance? It would be the Grand Ayatollah in Najaf. And this is the place that the American military has occupied. So the American government is now the custodian of the holiest sites and the most authoritative sites of Shiite Islam. It is now a commonplace that Iraq is divided into demographic zones. It's also not entirely true, but it has some truth to it. That dark green part and the light green down in the south are where the Shiites predominate in Iraq. The white part is where the Sunni Arabs, who are 20%, predominate. The white part is misleading because a lot of that is sand. And then in the north, you have the brown part is where the Kurds predominate. The Kurds are not Arabs. They speak an Indo-European language, ultimately related to English. Just to give you an example, the Kurdish word for brother, bra. You can hear it, bro, bra. The Arabic word for brother, akh. Not the same language family. So the people, both the Sunnis and the Shiites south of Kurdistan are Arabs. And the Kurds, we won't go into it today so much, but they have their own vision of an autonomous Kurdistan up there in the north. The initial plan of the U.S. government for, or at least of the Department of Defense, which seems to have its own foreign policy, for Iraq was to hand Iraq over to a small group of expatriate politicians, chief amongst them Ahmad Chalabi. Chalabi was a favorite of the Pentagon, supplied defectors and much of the information on the basis of which the war effort was made. This information largely turned out to be untrue. Chalabi is said to have characterized this after the fact as a noble untruth and said, "We are in Baghdad." That plan to turn Iraq over to Chalabi, however, because of internal disputes within the Bush administration, got scotched. Chalabi was indicted and convicted in Jordan for embezzling $300 million from his own bank. And there were some in the Bush administration who felt it was unwise to turn a whole country over to him. And he, moreover, hadn't provided reliable intelligence. He recently ran for office in Iraq and was unable to gain a seat in the Iraqi parliament. We only needed 40,000 votes for that. So I think we may conclude that he's not popular in Iraq. So that plan went by the wayside, and the State Department and the British played a part in getting rid of it. The next plan was to have Iraq ruled by a MacArthur figure, somebody, an American, who would essentially rule the place. Paul, known as Jerry Bremer, a longtime State Department official who had served as ambassador to the Netherlands, had been very early in his career for 6 months handing out visas in Kabul and knew some Persian, and had ultimately left the State Department after 25 years and went to work for Henry Kissinger's security firm, was brought in to essentially rule Iraq. And the initial Pentagon plan of quickly turning Iraq over to a hand-picked set of local expatriate politicians was shunted aside in favor of having Bremer run the country himself. And he had a 7-stage plan for Iraq, and they would write a new constitution for the country, and the last stage, ultimately, they would hold elections and turn the country over to an elected government. This 7-stage plan was explicitly drawn from the experience of the United States in post-war Germany and Japan. And in fact, they went back in the Pentagon archives and found old German documents about the occupation of Germany, which they translated into English for this plan. They did it so quickly that at one point, one of the documents said that it was important that the United States support the value of the Iraqi Reichsmark. This 7-stage plan assumed Bremer being able to give orders and them being obeyed. Bremer, however, as soon as he came into office, dissolved the Iraqi army. And it's not entirely clear to me how he expected to give orders and have them obeyed if he didn't have an Iraqi army. And of course, there weren't very many US troops there. And they didn't know Arabic, and they couldn't make people do things. So, of course, he didn't come up with this idea of dissolving the army. He was ordered to do that by Rumsfeld. But that was a blow. And then some of the lieutenant colonels out in the countryside, who basically became the mayors of the various Iraqi cities, wanted to go quickly towards local municipal elections, and Bremer disallowed this. There was going to be an election in the holy city of Najaf, very influential city, a real sort of opinion maker in Iraq, and Bremer canceled that election when he heard that a Shiite pro-Iranian party might win. He was concerned about Iranian influence in Iraq. I don't think Mr. Bremer really knew very much about Iraq before he went there, and there are many anecdotes about his ignorance. But I just want to observe that the anti-Iranian Shiites of Najaf just aren't very numerous, and where you would find a mayor of Najaf that would not be at least mildly pro-Iranian is mysterious to me. And it was always very amusing that Bremer kept talking about limiting Iranian influence among the Shiites of Iraq. It struck me as sort of like saying, well, we have to be careful that the Vatican doesn't get influence among the Catholics of Ireland. One of the things that Mr. Bremer appears not to have known about was Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani. Sistani was born in Iran, in Mashhad, in 1930, came to Najaf in late 1951, and gradually went up the ladder of clerical authority until he emerged as the chief Grand Ayatollah of Najaf. In the Shiite system, lay people who don't have a seminary degree ought to pay attention to what someone like Sistani says about religious law and practice. Lay people don't know how to derive the law themselves. I mean, the law is there. It's in the Quran. It's in the sayings and doings of the Prophet and his descendants. It's in the consensus of the great jurisprudence of the past. There's a kind of reasoning that can be applied to the law. But you need years of seminary study in order to do it properly, according to the Shiite system that Sistani belongs to. So some Shiite texts of the 18th century that I read have compared it to having a family physician. I would say, well, you wouldn't want to operate on yourself. If you had an operable condition, you would want to go to a surgeon. So in the same way, you wouldn't want to try to run your spiritual life by yourself. If you have a question about religious law, you should go to Sistani. And so the system is that all lay people must implicitly obey a formal legal ruling from someone like Sistani if they follow him, and most Shiites outside of Iran do. He has enormous authority. Sistani did not like the 7-point plan of Mr. Bremer. And what Mr. Bremer didn't know in May and June of 2003 was that if Sistani did not like the 7-point plan, then it wasn't going to happen. Mr. Bremer announced that he was going to appoint a committee to write the constitution for Iraq, and Sistani begged to differ. He issued a fatwa, a formal legal ruling, that said that there was no guarantee that the American-appointed Constituent Assembly that was supposed to write the Constitution, quote, will draft a constitution that conforms with the highest interests of the Iraqi people and would express its national identity, one basis of which is the pure Islamic religion and noble social values. He then went on to say that the Constitutional Committee must be elected by the Iraqi people. He demanded popular sovereignty in the drafting of the Iraqi Constitution, and explicitly because he believed that the Iraqi people would draft a constitution if it were an elected group that gave a special place to Islam. Bremer would have written a highly secular constitution for Iraq, which Sistani didn't agree with. Sistani's vision for Iraq was that it would have a lay parliament and a lay prime minister, that is to say, it wouldn't be run by clerics. He wants the clerics to stay in the seminary, and they can intervene in public affairs through issuing fatwas of legal opinions on various issues, and he expects that the pious would pay attention to those. But he didn't want, as in Iran, he didn't want the clerics actually to run the government. He favors clerics having a position in the judiciary, so many benches, court benches, would be run by ayatollahs. And he sees two major sources of authority. One is popular sovereignty, the elected will of the people, and the other is the approval of the system by the Grand Ayatollahs in Najaf. So it's a dual source of sovereignty, and both are important to him. This idea of the general will expressing itself in popular sovereignty is not a traditional one in Shiite law. In fact, I looked for it in the Quran and the sayings of the Imams and didn't find it there. It is, however, present in the work of an obscure 18th century Imam, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Sistani has read Rousseau in translation and has decided, as he has the authority to do, that Rousseauian ideas about the general will and popular sovereignty are compatible with Shiite principle. So the 7-point plan from the Pentagon archives didn't work out. Bremer, moreover, faced a growing guerrilla insurgency in the Sunni Arab areas, which made the country very difficult to govern. The idea that he was going to be MacArthur and give orders throughout Iraq and reform the country and write the Constitution and rule for 7 years, just, or 2 or 3 or however many he intended to, just wasn't going to happen. The Green Zone, where Bremer had his headquarters, increasingly took mortar fire, and Bremer was almost assassinated. I'm quite sure that General MacArthur in his Tokyo headquarters never took any mortar fire. So this was not like that. If you listen to the Coalition Provisional Authority spokespeople, people like Dan Senor, or the Washington spokespeople, they kept comparing the situations, but they weren't, in fact, comparable. So Mr. Bremer moved away from the initial plan very quickly and decided that it would simply be necessary for the United States to hand formal sovereignty, at least, over to an Iraqi government. And he wanted initially to have that happen in May of 2004, and he envisaged that there would be an elected Iraqi parliament. However, the electorate that elected this parliament would be very circumscribed. It would consist of members of the provincial and some municipal councils. When the Americans and the British massaged into being, in some way that's not entirely clear to me, councils of Iraqis who were supposed to be running the provinces. So it was those pro-American sort of hand-picked notables who would elect the Iraqi parliament. As you might imagine, This plan was rejected by the Grand Ayatollah Sistani because, of course, it doesn't embody the principle of popular sovereignty. And he rejected the plan and called for the UN to come in and midwife the new Iraqi government. It was said in the Iraqi press by those close to Bremer that the Americans were offended by this call for UN involvement in Iraq, because the whole point of invading Iraq was to sideline the UN. Sistani gave another fatwa for reporter Anthony Shadid of the Washington Post, in which he said, the instrumentality envisaged in the Bremer Plan for electing the members of the transitional legislature does not guarantee the formation of a parliament that truly represents the Iraqi people. It must be changed to some other method which would guarantee it, and that is direct elections, such that the parliament would derive from the will of the Iraqis and would represent them in a just manner and will safeguard it from any challenge to its legitimacy. So he says in Arabic, al-hukuma al-shar'iyya munbathiqa min iradat al-shab al-Iraqi. The legitimate government derives from the will of the Iraqi people. It's a little bit amusing that the Grand Ayatollah of Najaf is instructing the U.S. government in this principle. And Mr. Bremer, having not learned from his previous lesson that he couldn't in fact get anybody to write the Constitution, also rejected Sistani's fatwa again. You know, there's an anecdote from the late 19th century Iran that Nasruddin Shah, the great Shah of Iran at that time, gave a tobacco concession to a British firm that it would be allowed to have a monopoly in marketing Iranian tobacco. And in return, the firm would pay a royalty directly to the Shah. So it was good to be the king. But this plan harmed tobacco growers, merchants, the ulama, the clergy were offended by it because it gave control of an Iranian resource to foreigners. And so there's a nationwide movement, one of the first in modern history in Iran, against the tobacco monopoly. And the then equivalent of Sistani, the Grand Ayatollah, Hassan Shirazi, who was in Samarra in Iraq, gave a fatwa that nobody should smoke in Iran until the Shah rescinded this monopoly given as a concession to a British firm. So it is said that Nasruddin Shah was in his private chambers in his palace, and he clapped for the serving girl to bring him his hookah. And she said, "Oh no, sire, I may not do that." And he said, but why? She said, well, the Ayatollah has given the fatwa. So the Shah couldn't get his hookah. So Mr. Bremer didn't know this anecdote, but it turns out that when Sistani gave his fatwa, all of a sudden, gradually, nobody would go with Bremer's plan anymore. And when Mr. Bremer dragged his feet and didn't want to bring the UN in, didn't want to have the kind of one person, one vote, open elections that Sistani wanted, then Sistani brought out the crowds. This is a typical progression in Shiite history. First, there's the fatwa. If it doesn't have its intended effect, then there are the crowds. This is how the Shah got overthrown. It's a very effective progression. So 40,000 people came out in Basra in mid-January of 2004 and marched in a very disciplined way through the streets from one mosque to another. In Baghdad the following Tuesday, 100,000 people came out. And these were the largest demonstrations Iraq had seen since 1959. All of a sudden, the Americans were falling over themselves to implement Sistani's plan. Kofi Annan was sending an envoy to Iraq, and there were going to be open elections, and basically Sistani got everything he wanted. In fact, all along the way, every time there was a battle of wills between Sistani and Bremer, I'm afraid Mr. Bremer didn't come out of it very well. When he first went into Iraq, Bremer said, "We will go on imposing our will on the Iraqi people." Yeah. Then I saw him interviewed sort of April of 2004, and he said to Wolf Blitzer, he said, well, you know, the Iraqis really don't much like being occupied, and I have to say, it's not a lot of fun being an occupier either. So you could see he was getting tireder and tireder, and his attitude had completely changed. One of the other challenges that Bremer faced was from a less stately Shiite movement in Iraq, that of Muqtada Sadr. Muqtada Sadr's father was a Grand Ayatollah and had been assassinated by Saddam in 1999. And Muqtada had grown up traumatized and angry and somewhat violent, I'm afraid, as a result. And he had a much more hard line than Sistani. He insisted that the Americans get out of Iraq immediately. He staged regular demonstrations in Baghdad, Basra, and elsewhere. And his power base was dispossessed young men in the ghettos of Baghdad and other major Iraqi cities, of which there was no lack. He established a militia. By April of 2004, that militia came into direct military conflict with the U.S. military. It took the U.S. military 2 months of hard fighting to subdue it. And even then, it was partially because Sistani intervened to negotiate a settlement. Mr. Bremer cooperated with the United Nations, however distasteful that might have been, to appoint a caretaker Iraqi government, the main purpose of which was to preside over the process that would lead to open elections, which Sistani had demanded and which he was going to get, but which would be held in January of 2005. The U.S. brought in for this transitional purpose Ayad Alawi, an old CIA asset who had been active in recruiting military defectors, high officers, in hopes of making a coup against Saddam in the old days. Mr. Bremer turned sovereignty over to Mr. Alawi with the United Nations Security Council acquiescence in late June of 2004. I was called by a reporter in May and was asked by this reporter who had stars in her eyes about this whole process, from where would I be viewing the transfer ceremony? And I told her that since the transfer ceremony was going to take mortar fire, that I intend to view it on television, if it were in fact to occur, from the safety of my living room. In fact, it was so dangerous in Iraq that Mr. Bremer was not able to hold the desired transfer ceremony, which would have attracted mortar fire. And so he shook Mr. Alawi's hand, and 2 days early, it was supposed to be on July 1st, snuck out of the country at night. It was an ignominious end, I'm afraid, to his year in Iraq. Again, that August, fighting broke out between the Mahdi army of the militant Shiites and the Marines in Najaf. Ultimately, this was settled by Sistani, who got off of his sickbed. He had gone to London for heart surgery. Got off his sickbed, flew back to Iraq, and from the southern city of Basra, he announced a civilian march, a kind of Gandhist maneuver, in which he said people should just march to Najaf. So thousands of civilians marched into Najaf, and as they came into the city, gradually it became impossible to fight anymore. So the fighting stopped. And Muqtada escaped under the cover of this convergence, and Sistani had a stern talk with him, after which he has turned to civil politics. So now we're going to have an election in January of 2005, and the electoral system has been set up on a proportional basis with lists. This is a system that's used in Spain and some other countries. The good thing about it is that since the whole country was the unit that was voting, there weren't like congressional districts or anything. It's more like our presidential election, but it was for parliament. Since the whole country was voting, one strategy you could use would be to try to get some Kurds to vote for you, some Shiites to vote for you, some Sunnis to vote for you, and then you could put together a broad-based government. But since Iraq is 60% Shiite, there is another strategy that could be used to dominate the government, which is if you could get all the Shiites to vote for a single list, then they'd have a majority in parliament. And the people around Sistani include sort of former nuclear physicists and things like that. So they gamed out the UN system. And so Sistani went to all of the Shiite parties, called them to his home in Najaf, and said, "You will run on a single list." And he's the Grand Ayatollah, so what could they do? The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, about which I'll speak in a moment, the Dawa Party, an old Islamist party, and others ran on this United Iraqi Alliance. The Dawa Party was led by Ibrahim Jafari, who had fled Iraq in 1980 for Iran, and then in 1989 had gone to London. And the Dawa Party wanted an Islamic state. It had since 1958. The other major party here was the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, formed in Tehran in exile in 1982. At that time, Saddam was cracking down hard on the Shiites, so a lot of Shiite leaders fled to Iran. The transformation of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq into an ordinary parliamentary political party strikes me as likely to be incomplete. And they have talked about how their leader, Abdulaziz al-Hakim, has talked about how, well, at first you might have to have this pluralistic kind of government, but ultimately, he said, the Shiite majority will make its will known. That sounds pretty ominous to me. The Americans insisted that they could only have this election in 2005 if they first removed the guerrillas from control of the city of Fallujah in western Iraq. So they assaulted it in November of 2004, but with the result that they destroyed it. And then the rest of the Sunni Arabs became extremely angry about this event, and they all went into rebellion. So cities that had been quiet, like Mosul, a city of over 1 million in northern Iraq, mainly Sunni Arab, exploded in violence, and 4,000 police resigned, and there were checkpoints and militants in the street. Ramadi, most of the Sunni Arab areas went completely out of control. This was a disaster for the elections because the UN system was proportional. It was like we're all sharing a pie. And if I cut myself a very small piece of the pie, then you get a bigger piece. So the danger was that the Sunni Arabs were angry and boycotted the election, and moreover, anyway, it was insecure in their regions to vote. So it means they were going to cut themselves a very small piece of the pie. What that would do is to magnify the number of seats that the Shiites and the Kurds held, which is what happened. The Shiite United Iraqi Alliance, Sistani's list, which he issued a fatwa for people to vote for, gets 51% of the seats in this election. The Kurds are the second biggest group. The secular Shiite middle classes vote for the Alawi list, the Iraqi list, in very small numbers. They only get 14% of the seats. And then the Sunnis, the poor things, only get 17 seats out of 275. They're about 20% of the population, so they ought to have had 50 or 60. This is a huge disaster as an outcome for one major reason. This parliament was to craft the permanent constitution of Iraq, because Sistani had given the fatwa that the elected delegates of the Iraqi people must craft the constitution. So what it means is that the Shiites and the Kurds are going to be the ones that craft the permanent constitution, and they're going to craft it in ways that the Sunni Arabs don't like, But you can imagine what would happen if the Sunni Arabs raise objections. They can easily be voted down because they're so tiny inside parliament. And then in the provinces, because there were provincial elections at the same time, the Shiite religious parties, the fundamentalists, won big time. 11 of Iraq's 18 provinces were dominated by Shiite fundamentalists, either the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq or the Sadrists, who controlled 2 of the provinces. So you had the far religious right or the farther religious right in the provinces. Well, of course, a Shiite fundamentalist government, which is what came to power in those elections, would likely have warm relations with Tehran. Many of them had been exiled in Tehran in the 1980s. And so Ibrahim Jafari, who becomes prime minister, the leader of the Dawa party, flies off to Tehran, where he has very warm consultations with the Iranian government of the time. The Iranians offer him $1 billion in foreign aid. They offer him pipelines and Iranian facilities for refining Iraqi petroleum. They offer him the use of Iraqi ports. You haven't seen this much wheeling and dealing over petroleum since the Texans found out about Saudi Arabia. Also, at the same time, the fundamentalist Shiites took control of a large number of cabinet positions, obviously. One of them is the Ministry of Interior. I should signal to you that the Ministry of Interior in most parts of the world is like our FBI. It's not mainly concerned with like forests and things. It's more like our Homeland Security or something. So the Ministry of Interior went to the Shiite Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which had a paramilitary, the Badr Corps, trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So that was the group from which many of the Ministry of Interior police commandos were drawn. And they had certain deficits in the social graces and began rounding up Sunnis they suspected of being insurgents and jailing them in secret jails where they were tortured. Can't imagine where the model would have come from for that. And this ultimately becomes a huge scandal. So then they craft the Constitution, the permanent Constitution for Iraq. And there's a big battle between them, the Shiite religious forces, and the Americans. Remember, the Shiites have 51% in parliament, so they have a very strong voice. And they push through a constitution that says that Islam is the religion of state. Can't possibly be what Mr. Rumsfeld had originally been going for. That the civil parliament may pass no legislation that contravenes the established laws of Islam. That personal status laws may be implemented by the individual according to their religious right. Which originally the Constitution was going to make a special place in the Iraqi system for the Grand Ayatollahs of Najaf, but that got shot down by the Americans and the Kurds, I think. The other major set of provisions that were controversial in this Constitution were concerning federalism, but not what we would think of as federalism. Let me explain. The Americans, after the Gulf War, established a no-fly zone in the north of Iraq to protect the Kurds from reprisals by Saddam. And that was very effective. And the Kurds, basically it covered 3 provinces of northern Iraq. The Kurds made a provincial confederacy. They called it Kurdistan. And they had confederacy elections, confederate-wide elections. They weren't on the province basis. So there's a president of Kurdistan, Masoud Barzani. There's a prime minister, there's a parliament of these 3 provinces. And the Kurds are desperate to keep that system even as they're drawn back into Iraq. So one of the things that the U.S. overthrow of Saddam meant for the Kurds was a danger that their privileges and their autonomy would be taken back away by the new Iraqi government. And they fought that. And so they actually managed to convince the Shiite Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq to go in their direction and to adopt this principle of loose federalism and also provincial confederacies. Now, why might that be attractive to the Supreme Council? Well, because it had become a provincial power. It controlled so many of those southern Shiite provinces. And there are two major petroleum fields in Iraq. One is Rumaila in the south, which is controlled by the Shiites, and the other is Kirkuk in the north, which is controlled by the Kurds. So, if you made provincial confederacies in the Shiite south, which had control over local petroleum, which is what the Constitution allows them to do, then those confederacies get rich, and they don't have to share as much with the rest of Iraq, which is to say the Sunni Arabs who don't have petroleum are getting cut out of this deal altogether. So it would be as though it would be all right for Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana to make a provincial, a confederacy, and then to elect a Congress that represented those three states to have a prime minister. And if Washington wanted to deal with Austin anymore, that they would have to go through the Confederate government. And then they would tell Washington that, you know, those tax monies you get on Texas and Louisiana petroleum, well, you're not going to be getting that anymore. That's the kind of thing that's being done in Iraq. The last time we had a confederacy in this country, it caused a lot of problems. So this Constitution, with these provisions for a very loose, weak federal government, sort of like our Articles of Confederacy, which didn't work very well, and with these provisions for Islamic law and so forth, went to a national referendum on October 15th. And Iraq voted as two countries, basically. The Shiites, the light green in the south, and the Kurds, the yellow in the north. All of their provinces voted for the Constitution, but Anbar, Salahuddin, and Nineveh, the three sort of dark green provinces that are dominated by Sunnis, all rejected the Constitution. So you've got a Constitution that a major ethnic group, 20% of the population, who were the WASPs of the country, the equivalent of the Harvard MBAs and the West Point graduates and so forth. They've got a constitution that's rejected by this entire ethnic group. Now, the American plan was to go to yet another round of parliamentary elections for a permanent parliament, or one that would last for 4 years, on December 15th. And this time, the Sunni Arabs parties decided to participate in the elections. They had boycotted them in the previous January. They did not make this decision because all of a sudden they accepted the new situation. They made it because it was, in their view, one way of fighting the new situation. So Adnan Dulemi of the fundamentalist Sunni group led a coalition called the Iraqi Accord Front. This coalition is full of hardline Sunni clerics and others that we think probably have some kind of back channel relationship to the guerrilla movement. So some of these people were also former Baathists, and some were disallowed from running in the end. You know, the fact that the Sunni Arabs are willing to have representation in parliament doesn't mean that all of a sudden they're not going to blow things up anymore. And in fact, they've gone on blowing things up in the aftermath anyway. Another big development for the December 15th elections was that Muqtada Sadr, who earlier had boycotted the elections as well, agrees to join the United Iraqi Alliance. And was given 30 seats within it. He also ran some people on an independent list and got 2 that way. And his demands were non-recognition of Israel, withdrawal of U.S. troops, and a strong federal government. In other words, he doesn't agree with the consensus that had been reached through the constitutional process between the big Shiite parties and the Kurds. But he joins in with the other religious Shiite parties this time. Muqtada doesn't have the religious credentials of a Sistani, but he has enormous popularity because of his father, who was much beloved. And he himself is kind of an ABD, you know, all but dissertation. He hasn't quite finished his degree. In fact, he is said to have grown up really liking to play video games, and in Najaf they call him Abu Atari. Source of his authority is not the erudite books that he has written, let us say. Well, they go to the elections, and the Americans are putting out the word from Washington that Alawi, who's running again, and his list, which is more secular, are going to do very well, and Alawi has a shot at being prime minister and so forth. I can't explain the fantasy world that these people live in, but it was obvious to me where Iraqi politics was going, and it wasn't towards Alawi, an ex-Ba'athist. I mean, that's really, you know, going to be popular. And in fact, Alawi gets only 9% of the vote this time, half what he got the last time. Because the Sunni Arabs come on board, the Shiite proportion is cut a little bit, but they still, the religious Shiite parties get almost 51%. They're just a little bit short of it. The Kurds got their 58. Their proportion was cut back, again, because it's proportional, so if the Sunni Arabs actually come out and vote, the Shiite and the Kurdish seats are cut a bit. The Sunni fundamentalist parties, the hardline religious parties, the ones that, you know, are like maybe 2 steps away from Al-Qaeda, they get 44 seats. And somehow, I don't know, there are champagne toasts in Washington about how wonderful this is. I don't understand. And then the National Dialogue Front, who are basically Baathists, get 11 seats. So this configuration for the December 15th elections has all kinds of interesting potential. First of all, the Shiite bloc, the religious parties are the largest, and they will form the government. They will have the prime minister, but there'll be a very weak element because in order to get to 138 seats, which is 51%, they need 8 partners from among the small parties and so forth. So if there are a few small parties that got elected, got maybe 1 seat, and they just got a free meal ticket. They just pretty much anything they wanted, they've got a wish machine, because that's how the Shiite religious parties would make their 51%, is by bringing those aboard. So the Christians got 1 seat this time. They're about 3% of the population, so they should have more, but they just got 1. And they've announced that they're joining the Shiite fundamentalist alliance. So I just don't think that probably was a decision that was made on ideological grounds. I suspect that if we looked into the bank accounts of the Christian party, that sums will have been transferred. The other interesting thing about this configuration is that the Shiites, who are this big blue bloc there, could rule in part by making sectional alliances on issues. So if an issue came up like, should we have more Islamic law, the Kurds would be against that, because although they're Muslims, they're traditionalists. They're like the Brazilian Catholics. They like some music and good times at their religious festivals. So, but the Shiite fundamentalists and the red Sunni fundamentalists there could make an alliance. It would be 178 seats, so it would be a big alliance against the Kurds and the secularists on Islamic issues. So you could have a kind of pan-Islamic principle on some issues. Then on federalism, where the Sunnis are dead set against this kind of loose federalism, the Shiites could go with the Kurds. And they might even lose Muqtada Sadr's people on that, because he's against loose federalism. But the Kurds and the rest of the Shiites probably can make a majority anyway. So you could see this kaleidoscopic kind of politics in here. I have said all that. The Sunni participation so far doesn't seem as though it's going to contribute to an end of the guerrilla war anytime soon, because soon after the elections there were a whole string of big bombings in Baghdad and people have been assassinated and the trouble goes on. So in conclusion, Iraq had been ruled by a secular Arab nationalist party that tried to make a platform that was attractive across sectarian lines to the Shiites, to the Christians, even to the Kurds, although that was less successful. The basis for politics since the United States overthrew the Ba'ath Party now has shifted very rapidly towards sectarian and linguistic markers. So it is whether you're Shiite or Sunni, whether you're Kurd or Arab, that matters in politics now. And although the Iraqis have a rhetoric left over from the old time of national unity and Arab nationalism and all that, that plays down those things. And I'm constantly, when I give these talks, I'm lectured. Some Iraqi will stand up and say, but we don't have Sunni and Shia in Iraq. And I said, well, yes, I understand that maybe that was how it was in the 1950s and 60s when you were growing up. But we do have these electoral charts now, and they do seem to indicate that people are voting on sectarian lines. The Kurds now will function in the new parliament as a swing vote. They will try very hard to maintain their regional autonomy. And I think now that the Muqtada people have come into the government, there's going to be a fight within the Shiites over whether to move to the Kurdistan model or not for the Shiite South. It's not clear how that fight will come out. One interesting possibility is that the new Iraqi parliament will demand the withdrawal of the United States. I figure between the Sadr representatives and the Sunnis, they already have a good 100 members of parliament who would vote today to get rid of the United States altogether from Iraq. And they only need 38 more from the other Shiite representatives and the independents to get such a resolution. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see the new Iraqi parliament make such a demand sometime in the coming year. And that's going to provoke a crisis if it happens, because the big mainstream Shiite parties are kind of invested in the Americans staying around for a while, because that's how they got into power and how they might stay in power and not just be taken out and killed by the Sunnis. And then the Kurds want the Americans to stay. The Kurds are desperate that the Americans continue to shape Iraq in a way that protects Kurdish perquisites. So there could be a crisis over that. And if the Iraqi parliament did pass a resolution demanding an immediate U.S. withdrawal, and if the United States did start withdrawing, there's a big question about whether Iraq might not fall into some kind of civil war amongst themselves. We're entering now, I think, if at all possible, into an even more parlous period of Iraqi history and of U.S.-Iraqi relations. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. At dinner last night, Professor Cole said there are two outcomes of the elections. One is disastrous and the other one is catastrophic. Anyway, there are a couple of ground rules for questions. First of all, we're going to take them from undergraduates, and then we will turn to the larger audience. So, students, what are your questions? Yeah, Tim.
There seems to be a political divide between the constituents.
Stand up.
Stand up and project.
There seems to be a sort of division among the Shiites between the followers of al-Sadr and Sistani. Now, Sistani obviously has more power, but he's also an old 76. As you mentioned, he has heart problems. If he were to die tonight, how would the political status of al-Sadr change, and stature will he stand to gain?
Well, the question has to do with the relative weight of Muqtada Sadr and Grand Ayatollah Sistani politically in Iraq. Well, first of all, in the Shiite religious system, Muqtada Sadr is nobody. He's like a ill-mannered graduate student. And nobody would pay attention to his religious edicts because he doesn't have the stature and the erudition that comes with that territory. On the other hand, he has a kind of sectarian appeal. So his father was widely adored, and people adore him for the same reason, because he's his father's son. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, the people in the Shiite slums don't really care he's written books. He hasn't written books. They can't read books. They care that he has this charisma. So mostly Sistani's authority and Muqtada's authority don't come into a lot of conflict, because if you ask people on the Shiite street, who do you follow, they'll say the Hausa, the Shiite religious establishment. They would include both Muqtada and Sistani all in it, and they wouldn't tend to think that the two were at odds. Sistani and Muqtada do come into conflict occasionally, but mostly over tactics. Sistani and Muqtada both want the Americans out, but Sistani wants them out on a gradual timetable. Muqtada wants it immediately. Both of them are against this loose federalism business that the Kurds have introduced, and in that regard, they're allies. Sistani doesn't like this idea of having these militias. He wants a government to have authority. So there are issues between the two. But Muqtada really is a minor figure compared to Sistani with regard to religious authority. The degree that he has authority, it comes from his ability to put these thugs on the street. And that's been cut down on by the Marines. If Sistani were to die, the system in Najaf is that there are several Grand Ayatollahs, one of whom then would emerge as the chief Grand Ayatollah. So there are three others. There's Muhammad Ishaq Fayyad, who's an Afghan, and very pro-American, and very much against the Iranian system of clerical rule. Then an Afghan chief Grand Ayatollah would be an interesting development. He'd have good relations with Karzai. Then there's a Pakistani, Bashir Najafi, who's from Karachi, who never has forgiven the Americans for 1991 when they allowed Saddam to crush the Shiite rebellion after the Gulf War. And he speaks angrily about that. I think he doesn't like the Americans very much. And he's not as much against Shiite clerical rule as Fayyad. And there's Mohammad Saeed al-Hakim, who's an Iraqi distant cousin of the leader of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. People don't seem to think he's in the running. They say he has a weak personality. So it will be probably either the Afghan or the Pakistani. And one very pro-American, one kind of anti-American. You know, in the British period, they used to intrigue in Najaf to see if they can't get their guy in. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Marine Corps has a position on who should succeed Sistani. If Sistani died, there would be jockeying between these two until it became clear, and it's by consensus, so one of them would emerge as the Grand Ayatollah. And he would continue to have that kind of authority from his erudition, his learning, and so forth from the Shiite masses. So I don't think it would matter. I mean, Muqtada has his followers, but they're following him on a completely different set of grounds.
Okay, Morgan?
Can you talk about the economic platforms of the new Iraqi government? I know that Americans are pushing hard for privatization and liberalization of the Iraqi economy, and you mentioned how a lot of the moderate Shia, such as Sistani, are in some ways dependent upon the U.S. to stay in power. So I was wondering if the United States would use that as a leverage position to sort of push their economic platforms in Iraq, and how that would impact Iraqi society as a whole.
Yes. It's a very good question. The question is on economic policy of the various factions. the Dawa Party, which is led by Ibrahim Jafari, was formed in the late 50s to compete against the communists and the Baathists, who at that time were growing in popularity in Iraq. And so one way of competing was to adopt a more or less socialist agenda itself. So the Dawa Party has a long tradition of thinking about how an Islamic state would try to ensure social justice, and of being frankly influenced by socialist ideas in this regard. So my impression is that Ibrahim Jafari, the leader of the Dawa Party and who's been prime minister for the past nearly a year, is not so eager to move to kind of Polish-style shock therapy and rapid privatization and so forth. On the other hand, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq has among its leaders a man named Adil Abdul Mahdi, who's now, as we speak, you know, this jockeying is going on, whether the new prime minister will be Abdul Mahdi or will be Jafari. Adil Abdul Mahdi was a Marxist in the 1960s as a young man, and then briefly had a fling with Baathism, and then ultimately moved over and joined the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, the Shiite fundamentalist party. So he was in exile from Iraq in Paris and studied economics in France, speaks fluent French, is this sort of Iraqi Shiite fundamentalist who's like a left bank intellectual. And he's a man of what they call in ballet, rang jeté. He's gone from Marxism to Baathism to Shiite fundamentalism, and he's now leaped over and become a free marketeer. So I can tell you who they're rooting for in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad to be the new prime minister. It's Adil Abdul Mahdi. If he became prime minister, he'd push for privatization. And it was one of the plans of the Bremer administration was to do a Polish-style shock therapy. They actually had Polish economic advisors. And they found that multinational corporations were a little unlikely to buy state factories in Iraq as long as bombs were going off in them. So that privatization program, which was part of the whole thing, didn't go forward. In fact, Jay Garner, who was the first individual nominated to run Iraq by the Americans and who was ousted, gave an interview with the BBC in which he said he believed that the Iraqi army was dissolved because the Bremer was afraid that as a Baathist institution with a socialist background, it would stand in the way of economic privatization. So if they really did get rid of the army so that they could privatize the economy, they shot themselves in the foot, because if you don't have an army, you don't have an economy to privatize. So all of these things have remained high concept. I mean, at the moment, if you had $100,000, would you invest it in Iraq? So that would be what would be necessary, is bright young persons like yourself with money who would go into Iraq. And so that's not going to happen anytime soon. So they can privatize all they like in their heads, but in fact, there's not much of an economy. Yeah, well, the question is, you know, what does it look to me like with regard to a timeline for the U.S. getting out of Iraq? I think it'll be a gradual process. I think, given that we have congressional elections coming up in November of 2006, and given that this Iraq enterprise, I think, has become increasingly unpopular with the American public, I wouldn't be surprised if there's an announcement of a withdrawal of 30,000 troops right around September 15th, going into those elections. Since the troops are not actually preventing the bombs from going off, this is sort of guerrilla insurgency seems to be impervious to whatever the U.S. military is able to do. If you took out 30,000 troops, it probably wouldn't make very much difference. I expect this president to be committed to Iraq and to be unwilling to do a big drawdown of troops if he thought it would throw the country into, throw Iraq into severe instability or civil war. And I think he's pretty committed to his project in Iraq. So it may well be that it's 2009 that would see the big turn when you have a new president. And my suspicion is that a president of either of the major parties will want to run away from Iraq at that point. So I think you could see substantial withdrawals in the next 3 years, but I'd be very surprised if you didn't see a winding down on a large scale of this thing by then. And by then, you know, it takes about 5 years to stand up any kind of an army. The new Iraqi military might be increasingly able to stand on its own by 2009. I think it's a long-term process. I think there are things that could cause it to accelerate. As I said, if the Iraqi parliament demands a short timetable, that would accelerate it. But it should be remembered that even a short timetable for getting U.S. troops out of Iraq, I mean, just practically speaking, you can't do it in less than 6 months to a year. I mean, it's impossible, just the logistics of it. So even if that were to happen sometime in the next year, that would still be a 2-year timetable, and assuming that the U.S. military were willing. I'm a little bit afraid that there is a scenario in which, say, Muqtada Sadr manages to put together a parliamentary majority for a resolution on immediate U.S. withdrawal, and that it goes through, and the U.S. feels it necessary to acquiesce. Because I'm not sanguine that without some kind of outside military support, the new Iraqi army amounts to anything at all. Peter Galbraith is the former ambassador to Croatia and who was in Iraq in August looking at the new army, wrote me an email in which he maintained that it was completely worthless and there were very few units that could be depended upon. If the U.S. left too quickly, you know, the Sunni guerrillas are led by experienced Ba'ath officers, captains, majors, colonels, who know military tactics and who probably can take the green zone away from the Shiites and the Kurds downtown Baghdad if the Americans aren't there. And you know, one of the nightmare scenarios is the Sunni Arabs come down and kill Sistani. That would be a civil war right there. So we really don't have an interest in this country in having like really major instability in the Persian Gulf region. This would be bad for the world economy. And so what I say is that however the U.S. gets out of Iraq, they should do it very carefully.
Other questions from I'm still looking at the students. Do you have any? Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to make one thing clear. Okay, so is Jabari the new prime minister now?
We don't know.
Still unclear.
It's unclear. The United Iraqi Alliance, the Shiite fundamentalist parties, will provide the prime minister. But since there are three factions, Dawa, the Sadrists, and the Supreme Council, they haven't decided amongst themselves which faction will provide the prime minister. If it's Dawa, it will be Jafari. If it's the Supreme Council, it will be Adil Abdel Mahdi, the free marketeer. They were supposed to have made this announcement on Monday. They did not. They now say Saturday. The problem is that they haven't been able to come to a consensus within themselves or among themselves. And one way of handling this would be to go to a straight up and down vote. You have a meeting of all of the United Iraqi Alliance parliamentarians, and they vote for who they want as a prime minister, and whoever wins, wins. But the problem with doing it that way is that it might break up the alliance, which is a loose coalition. It might cause hard feelings. The person who is elected then would be seen as representing only a faction. of the largest bloc in parliament, and that would be bad for the bloc's relationship with the other groups. It would weaken them. So they much prefer if they can go forward on a consensus basis. And they haven't been able to attain that consensus. What it would require is that Adel Abdelmahdi or Jafari, one or the other, would be willing to accept, say, a high cabinet post or some other, say, a vice presidency or something, and would step aside for the other. That just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, Mike. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could give me some kind of idea on the daily economic life in Iraq. I mean, is there just mass unemployment? Are people being put to work by the government or public works practice? I mean, what's going on?
Well, the first thing to say is that the economy is different in every place. It's very regional. So in Kurdistan, up in the north, it's boom times. I have a friend in Kurdistan who sends me pictures. He drives to work along a road. And the early pictures along that road from a year and a half ago, the road is deserted. And then there's a house. And then there are two houses. And then there's like a suburban development. So in Kurdistan, Suleimaniya, Erbil, Dohuk, those places, it's good times economically. In fact, there are even guest workers going there and so forth. Then in the deep south, in the Shiite areas, it's very diverse again. A city of Basra has a lot of unemployment, a lot of problems, but then there's been a fair amount of oil and drug smuggling, which has brought money into the economy. It's black money, but you know the French say money has no smell. So there are sources of wealth coming in. The Rumaila oil fields have been able to pump. So that's some $17 billion a year. Petroleum revenue is coming into the central government, which then gets spread around the provincial bureaucracies as well. The government is still a very major employer. Private sector employment is very low and underutilized. It's hard to tell. You see estimates of unemployment anywhere from 28 to 50%. That tells me that A, unemployment is very high, B, nobody knows how bad it is. The Great Depression in the United States is estimated it was a 25% unemployment rate. So Iraq is at least at that level and maybe twice as bad. The economic situation is not good. The thing that is not really reported so much in the U.S. press, although there's been some recent reporting at the New York Times and the Washington Post, is that the Sunni guerrilla movement has a strategy of starving Baghdad for fuel and electricity. And it's a deliberate guerrilla strategy, if you look at the map, how they're doing it. So they're based in the center north of the country, the white parts on that map I showed you. And the refineries and pipelines that bring fuel down to Baghdad are from the Kirkuk fields. So they've closed those down. They keep bombing the pipelines. They bomb the refinery. The refineries and pipelines are very vulnerable. All you need is one mortar shell on a refinery and happy birthday. They have attacked fuel convoys going to Baghdad as well as pipelines and so forth. So the Baghdadis are not getting very much fuel. And this is the press often concentrates on how bad this is. It's cold, in Iraq in the winter. People don't have fuel, and how would you boil water, so it's bad for your hygiene and so forth. But what they don't usually say is, if you've got a small workshop, you can't run it without electricity. So all of the factories and workshops in Baghdad, they've got at most 6 hours of electricity a day, and that's off and on. So they can't work. It's paralyzing to the economy. And that's what the guerrilla goal is to paralyze the Baghdad economy. As the capital, it's the most important part of the country in their view. The economy in the center north and in Baghdad in particular is very, very bad because of these guerrilla actions. And they're hoping to ultimately, I think, to so disgust the Iraqi public with the lack of money and lack of jobs and lack of progress that they'll turn against the new government, and the Sunni guerrillas can then lead a coup and represent themselves as the man on horseback who can restore the country to its proper prosperity.
I'm looking for, still at the students? Yeah.
Hi there, Professor Cole. On March 19th, 2003, on your weblog, you wrote, "I remain convinced that for all the concerns about the aftermath, overthrowing the murderous Bath regime will be well worth the sacrifice on both sides." I was just wondering if you stand by that statement.
Yes. The question was that I had said on March 19th that the overthrow of the murderous Ba'ath regime would be worth the sacrifice. I was speaking in particular about the sacrifice of American and Iraqi lives that I knew was coming. My position on the war was that it could have been a legal war. According to the Genocide Convention, to which the United States and other United Nations members are signatory, any nation may go to the UN Security Council and designate a country, a regime, as a genocidal regime, and may ask the United Nations Security Council to remove that regime. That wasn't done. It could have been done. Certainly, it was a genocidal regime. I believe that there are two principles at issue in the war. One was the United Nations Charter and the legality of warfare in the absence of United Nations resolution. The other was the genocidal character of this regime. And, you know, Isaiah Berlin taught us that in life, you may like beauty and you may like truth, but in fact, you're often forced to choose between the two. I'm a good example of this. I think I tell the truth. Don't have the other thing very much. In this instance, I think we had a choice between the world community suffering along with the regime, which had invaded its neighbors, had gassed its own people, had committed horrible human rights violations, and was continuing to do so against the Marsh Arabs and others in the South, or upholding standards of international legality, which were instituted after World War II, which aimed at ending war, ending aggressive war, and which made it illegal for any country to go to war against another in the absence of a casus belli approved by the United Nations Security Council, unless it were a matter of immediate self-defense. Well, the United States wasn't attacked by Iraq, and so the self-defense was not, in fact, an issue. So I felt that the war could have been legal right up until the point in which the Bush administration, the Blair government, tossed the United Nations Security Council in the trash can, basically, and went to war without it. At that point, I felt the war was illegal. That's a different issue from whether the guys who got killed fighting the war made a noble sacrifice or not. And I think it's possible for them, and I have arguments with some of my readers about this, that it's possible for it to be the case that it was an illegal war, which therefore ought not to have been fought. And yet, for that supreme sacrifice to be meaningful insofar as it did bring down a genocidal regime. I'm afraid that if I ever ran for office, this particular reply would be made fun of as convoluted and naughty and so forth. But then we intellectuals are not afraid of the ambiguities of existence, and we're not actually convinced that life is simple, or indeed that consistency is always a good thing. You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds." So while my position may be convoluted, I hope it isn't evidence of a small mind.
Okay. Other questions from students? Okay, Charlie.
We were talking, first of all, we were talking about Sistani not liking the seven-stage plan of Bremner. You noted that he wanted to have approval of elections and the like, and he seemed to want the Ayatollahs to have the last word. This smells a little bit like the Supreme Council in Iran, and I wonder if you could talk about that, and if you wish to also on Iran
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the question is the exact relationship of popular sovereignty to the clerical authority. Basically, this issue goes back to the early 20th century. There was a constitutional revolution in Iran in 1905 through 1911, which was the first big movement among Shiites for Western-style constitutional government. And the clergy faced a dilemma because they came to understand popular sovereignty as a principle. But they thought to themselves, well, okay, if the people are the source of authority, that's all well and good. But what if this people decided to contradict Islamic law? What if a Muslim people decided to contradict Islamic law? And so in the 1906 Constitution, or as amended in 1907, they made a provision that parliamentary laws should be reviewed by a clerical council, sort of like our Supreme Court has judicial review, to ensure that no law is passed by Parliament that contravenes Islam. That provision in the Iranian Constitution was never actually invoked. So the clerics didn't actually get what they were promised in real history until 1979, when the clerics had a second chance. And this time they didn't take any chances. And they developed what was called a guardianship council, which has similar oversight over parliamentary legislation. The idea of a guardianship council, which would be called a shura or consultative council in the Dawa party of the 1960s, I think really goes back to not only the earlier Iranian precedent in the constitutional revolution, but also to the Dawa party platforms of the 1960s and 70s. And Sistani came up through that period and was influenced by all those same things. So there was actually an article in the Iraqi constitution as of July of 2005, which did have a council that would review legislation to make sure it was compatible with Islam. I believe Mr. Khalilzad of the American embassy lobbied extremely hard, and I don't know what exact blandishments were offered or what threats were made, but that paragraph went away. And it was clear that the Bush administration were afraid that were it in there, it would reflect very badly on it and be damaging to the administration. So that was avoided. So there's not a formal such institution in the new Iraqi constitution. So the stricture that Parliament is to pass no legislation that contravenes Islam, in my view, it's like the old 1907 stricture in the Iranian constitution of that time, which needn't be implemented because there's no body that's designated to make that decision. So you could have divisions of opinion about whether a piece of legislation contradicted Islam or not, and who would decide. I suppose it could go to a Supreme Court, but then the question is who's on the Supreme Court. Now, there is also a language in the Constitution that seems to encourage the appointment of clerics to judicial benches, to what we think of as civil judicial benches. So you could end up with a number of ayatollahs on the Supreme Court, in which case they might well rule against legislation on the grounds that it's un-Islamic and invoke that article of the Constitution. I would say you're getting Iran light here.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
What are the implications for Israel of the evolving situation in Iraq? What are the likely attitudes of the government for Israel?
Yeah. Question is, what are the implications for Israel of the evolving situation in Iraq? There are several implications for Israel. The one implication, which Yossi Alford pointed out to me last year, was that there is no longer any conventional military threat to Israel. And the Israeli military is actually mothballing some tanks. The closest army that might even fight Israel in some hypothetical situation is Iran, and it's a long way away for a conventional war. So I think the sort of the armored divisions of the Israeli military are much happier now. The Republican Guards are gone. 4,000 tanks were destroyed and so forth. On the other hand, the Israeli officer corps and intelligence divisions are really worried about the instability in Iraq, because Fallujah is just not that far from Jerusalem. And if you've got people like Zarqawi and this Al-Qaeda in Iraq running around blowing up things, now not only in Iraq but also in Amman, well, Amman is also not very far from Jerusalem. So I have an acquaintance who's a retired CIA officer who went to Israel last summer for a briefing by the Israeli military, and he told me that they're very upset, that they're very worried about the situation in Iraq spilling over onto Israel. The other thing is that not only are the Sunni Arabs of Iraq being radicalized in a way that could spread back through Jordan to the Palestinians, and yes, it is possible to be to the right of Hamas and to be more violent, but also for Israel's northern border, the likelihood is that Hezbollah has been strengthened by the rise of the Shiite religious parties in Iraq. Muqtada Sadr has very warm relations with Hezbollah. The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq does as well. And if the Iraqis get their act together and Iraq becomes prosperous, the Shiite religious parties are going to capture a lot of that oil wealth. So they're already billionaires. And it seems likely that Hezbollah becomes a client of theirs. They're going to funnel some of that money over to Hezbollah. And they're all very anti-Israeli, despite our neoconservatives dreamed that the Iraqi Shia, because they're a minority, would sympathize with Israel. That's just not worked out very well. Sistani gave a very strong fatwa against Israel on the occasion of the invasion of Jenin. Muqtada Sadr is very harsh on Israel, and in fact, he only agreed to join the United Iraqi Alliance if they made a commitment that there would be no recognition of Israel, and they needed him, so they made that commitment. And I think it's probably one of the reasons that Ahmad Chalabi ran alone, because he had been part of that coalition, but he has made open commitments to getting Iraq to recognize Israel, so he could hardly run in a party that had committed to the contrary. I think what I would say is, with regard to conventional military capabilities, Israel is more secure. With regard to soft power and Islamic fundamentalism and so forth, ideological threats, and with regard to unconventional capabilities such as those of Hezbollah and the Muqtada Sadr movement, Israel is less secure.
Well, I suspect we could spend another hour easily with questions, but let's give him a break and thank him very much.